Is your lawyer being straight with you and telling you everything you need to know before filing for permanent residence? Have you even had a discussion about the whole public charge issue? See, this topic is very hot right now, which is why I'm doing the video. But it's so many people are confused by it. So I wanted to give you the most updated information that I can. As you're well aware, this administration is using every excuse possible to deny permanent residence. And they're even going back and now they're going to check on the cases they approved before. They're even talking about thinking about denaturalizing people. What the frick? You know, it's so bizarre. This administration, I don't know. I don't know how much is just performative and how much he really believes. I believe Stephen Miller believes it, but I don't know about Trump, if Trump really cares. He's just, he's such a grifter. I don't know. Okay, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Okay. As you know, attorneys can be kind of arrogant about this. They think that they know. They ask a couple of questions. Have you ever used public assistance, let's say? What kind of a job does the U.S. citizen have? And they basically, with those two pieces of information, they decide whether or not they need to pursue anything else about public charge. But these days are not the old days, and everything needs to be looked at very closely. So, in fact, I was going to mention that there's an objection. If you watch, a lot of court TV, and there's objections like, oh, objection hearsay, objection relevance. Well, one of the objections is assuming facts not in evidence, and that's exactly what the attorneys are doing when they're not completely walking through the steps of public charge to make sure that you're not going to have a problem with this. It wasn't that long ago that as long as you had a good affidavit of support, that's all you needed. And it could be a joint, co-sponsor. Nowadays, that's not necessarily enough. Let's start at the beginning. What does it mean that the government thinks that you could be a public charge? That basically means they think that you might in the future have to rely on government benefits, food stamps, Medicaid, things like that. And they're trying to prevent people who are in that situation. Probably the biggest misconception is that people think that if they use public benefits that they're not eligible for permanent residence. That's not true, because not all government benefits count towards the public charge issue. And I'm going to tell you which ones count and which ones don't count a little bit later in the video. But I wanted to make sure that you understand right up front that if you have a medical emergency, you are allowed to go to the emergency room, period. So because there's so many misconceptions, people avoid medical care. You're allowed to go to the emergency room, right? People avoid using some kind of food assistance. Now, you're not allowed to have SNAP, food stamps. In fact, even once you become a permanent resident, you're not allowed to use that for 5 years. But throughout your neighborhood or your area, there are food pantries. Some of them are run by counties. A lot of them are run by churches where people donate food, and then you can go and take from that if you need to. There's no reason to be hungry in this country because they're assuming that you live within an area that's got food pantries. If you're out in the boondocks someplace, it might be more problematic, but there's nobody who lives in a big urban center or lives in the suburbs that doesn't have access to food pantries. A lot of times they don't even ask you. The ones that I know of, they want to see your ID because some of the pantries depend on what county you live in. You know, I live in Bucks County. I'm not supposed to use the pantries that are in Montgomery County. So they want to see exactly where you live. But most of them don't even ask what kind of income you have, how much money you're making. They don't ask. It's just if you think that you need some food because you're hungry and your kids are hungry, you can go to food pantries and not think twice. Now, here's one of the things that immigration attorneys know, but they don't always explain it to the clients. And that's that the adjudicator, USCIS adjudications officers, will look at the totality of the circumstances. There's not just one thing that's going to push them over the edge saying that this person's going to become a public charge in the future or could very well become a public charge. Start that again. They're going to look at the age of the immigrant. They're going to look at the health of the immigrant. They're going to look at the job skills that that person has. They might even already have a job lined up, which would be a nice added bonus to bring a job offer letter to the adjustment interview to show, oh, as soon as, well, maybe not. If you have work permission and you're already working, that's great. I would get another letter saying that they look forward to a long working relationship with you. However, a lot of times now people are getting their interviews before they've even gotten their employment authorization document. So if you don't have work permission yet, bringing a letter that says how much money you're going to be making. They don't want a letter that says Maria has been offered a job at our restaurant making $12.50 an hour, because that doesn't tell them how much money Maria is going to be making, because we don't know how many hours a week she's been offered. If you're going to do it through hourly and say, well, she's going to make $15 an hour, then you also have to add how many hours a week she'll be working. Or she's been offered a job for $400 a week working in our hotel as a housekeeper. That's all fine. They just want to be able to tell, well, how much a week or how much a month is she going to be making, or is he going to be making? If you're going to bring a letter like that, it has to be on letterhead, it has to be dated, and it needs to be signed. And even if it's, let's say Maria has a job helping an elderly neighbor, and she's going to be like a caregiver and going to be getting $500 a week to be this woman's caregiver. And you're like, well, you know, this old lady doesn't have letterhead. Then you just put the address of the person, the date underneath it, and then the letter would start with, to whom it may concern. It's not to who, by the way. To whom it may concern, colon. And then you just lay out the letter that, you know, I have offered Maria a job at $400 a week to take care of my elderly mother. And in that situation, I would have it signed in front of a notary. I would think you'd have to have it notarized because they don't know who the heck you are. You know, you could be any old person. I'd also put the address where she's going to be working and what her hours are going to be and what her duties are going to be. That's all good evidence to show she's going to be somewhat self-sufficient. If this is a marriage case, she would also, I presume, be helped out by her husband. But this might not be a marriage case. This might be a sibling case. This might be you've petitioned for your mother or your father. You know, one of the facts that they look at is how much education somebody has. That's basically to get some kind of an idea of how employable this person is. But look, if your dad is only 50 years old and he's been laying brick back in the old country for forever and ever, then it doesn't matter that he doesn't know how to read or write. It doesn't matter that he only went to 8th grade. He should also have some proof of his work experience back home so that they know, you know, that 1-2 punch of here's what he's been doing, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be like an official resume, but just sort of a page that explains he's been working as a bricklayer from 1986 until 2026. And then bring the other letter from some contractor you know who's offered him a job and how much he's going to pay him an hour and how many hours a week your dad's going to be working for him. Those 2 things should be sufficient along with an affidavit of support. We're going to talk about the affidavit of support a little bit near the end. I think I already did a video on the affidavit of support, but the other thing is also they look at the age, they look at the health, they look at the skills that the person has, but they also look at family support. So you might have petitioned for your mom and dad, but you also might have a sibling or 2 who are around, an uncle, an aunt, somebody else who can give financial support, also social, emotional support. They should be brought up and mentioned in the interview. Now we're going to look at the real honest-to-God red flags. One of them is low income, particularly of the sponsor. You might think that you make enough money, but if you have 3 kids, 4 kids, let's say you have 3 kids, it's you, your wife, and the 3 kids, that's 5, plus you're bringing mom and dad, that's 2 more, that's 7. So they're going to be looking to see if you're going to be able to keep them within the poverty guidelines. So low income for the U.S. sponsor is a problem. If you think maybe this might be an issue for you, get a joint sponsor. Better to have it and have her say, oh no, you're fine, you're okay, and not use it, than to need it and not have it. Which brings me to red flag number 2, not having an affidavit of support, which if you're using an attorney, there's no excuse for not having an affidavit of support. And the attorney should be able to tell you if this is enough or it's not. But, you know, a lot of people, I see a lot of people talking about doing these cases on their own. It's like, oh, you don't need an attorney. I did mine by myself. You know, just look up ChatGPT. They'll tell you what to do. Oh my God, you know, it's very upsetting. You know, it was bad back in the day when there were all these notarios that were lawyer wannabes. But now, everybody's telling everybody else just look it up on ChatGPT, and they'll tell you exactly what to do. It's like, well, you know, it doesn't hurt to actually have a consultation, even if you decide that you don't want to have an attorney. Because it's too much money, at least have a consultation. I know back in the day, I would do a consultation for somebody, and if they were sophisticated and they felt very confident that they could file this on their own, I would offer them the opportunity to have a second consultation with me. Again, it was on an hourly basis. It wasn't just like a flat fee. And so it depended on how long that consultation would be, but I offered that to many people. I said, you know, bring your package in before you mail it and let me look at it. I'll go through the forms, I'll go through all your documentation, I'll tell you what you need and what what you've done wrong, what you've answered wrong. I just did a thing about whether or not you can lie. You know, what the hell should you do if you lied on the form and now you have the interview? Well, if you had come to see me before you sent it in, you would not have lied on the form because we would have had a whole discussion about it. Same thing with the affidavit of support. So I know, since I did it, there are attorneys out there that will do that. Most won't. It doesn't make good business sense to do that. You should just say, the lawyer should just say, if you want me to do it, I'll do it. But I'm not checking your work because I'm not going to be responsible for your mistakes. I get it, but I don't know. That's one of the privileges of working for yourself. You can make up the rules as you go. And if I wanted to help somebody out, I had no problem doing that. But anyway, it's important to make sure that that affidavit of support is not missing. And like I said, better to have an affidavit of support and one from a joint sponsor if you're at all uncomfortable, if you think maybe this might not be enough. And that affidavit of support has to be complete. It needs your tax transcripts, right? They're not talking about photocopies of the 1040s that you have in your house. They want to see what was actually filed with the IRS. So you have to go on irs.gov and you got to get your tax returns. They say you only need 1 year. I'd get the last 3 years just to show that there's this steady income. Now, something that most people aren't thinking about. Remember I said remember what I said where they pay attention to the health of the person? Well, they want to know if this person is going to have health insurance. If that person is your spouse and you're working for someone who offers health insurance, not just to you, but also to your spouse, make sure that spouse is covered by your health insurance. Before she goes to the interview, make sure she's covered by health insurance. If, let's say you work for yourself, or your boss doesn't offer health insurance to other family members, you need to get some kind of health insurance for your spouse, for your mother, for your father, whoever. They really should have health insurance, especially if they have any kind of health issues. Is it going to be pricey? It could be. It could very well be. On the other hand, you might be petitioning for your sibling who's only, 23 years old, healthy as a horse. But nevertheless, you want to make sure you can at least show to immigration that you've been thinking, you're thinking ahead, and that you've decided to get health insurance for whoever it is that you're sponsoring. Very important. Well, this one I already mentioned. This is lack of work history or skills. Like I said, for a guy, it's kind of rare not to have any work skills. Maybe a mom, maybe if she's only been raising kids and grandkids and keeping the house and cooking, if she doesn't have any kind of a work history, you better have a pretty strong affidavit of support. And besides, if she's like 55, 60, 65, you really want mom working, especially in a country where she doesn't know the language and she doesn't know the culture and she probably doesn't want to be here in the first place. Just make sure you have a strong affidavit of support if you've got whoever it is that you're sponsoring doesn't have a lot of skills. That could also apply to that 22, 23-year-old sibling that you're bringing in. Might not have the most work experience. Make sure you prove it. You always have to prove stuff, okay? So have him have a job letter. If he's got certifications, maybe he's got a college degree or she's got a college degree, bring in a copy of the diploma. I wouldn't go too crazy about that, but bring in proof that the person has a college degree or that the person she's a certified makeup artist or something, just anything, or sometimes like a union card. That's another thing to show, he was a bricklayer back home, he was a member of the blah 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 union, right? Sorry, I don't know what the bricklayers union is. I don't even know what it is here. But you want to actually show that kind of stuff. So I promised you that I was going to tell you what counts as public benefits, or public benefits that count for the whole public charge thing, and what doesn't. One, easy, SNAP. Okay, any kind of food stamps. Now listen, if you've got USC children, and by that I mean US citizen children, they're allowed to get SNAP. They're allowed to have WIC. They're allowed to have, sometimes they're allowed to have some Medicaid assistance. But you're not. In fact, the immigrant's not allowed to have any kind of cash assistance or food stamps for the first 5 years. And in case you don't know it, by the way, if this is, you're doing all this for your spouse and then you guys get divorced, you're still on the hook, even though you're divorced, because that I-864 affidavit of support is a legal binding contract. So let's say you get divorced and 2-3 years later, or 4 years later even, she has a hard time and she applies for welfare and they give it to her even though it's a mistake, and then welfare realizes that, oops, we made a mistake, and they come after her to get those benefits back. Guess what? That falls on you. Even though you've been divorced, it doesn't matter. You're on the hook for until she has worked 40 quarters, which means 10 years, or she becomes a US citizen, or she leaves the country, or she passes away. That's it. Just because you got divorced doesn't mean that contract that you signed is null and void. It's not. I digress. Public benefits that count: SNAP, temporary assistance for needy families, Medicaid, which is mainly for low-income people. Oh, public housing. Listen, I had a guy going back a couple of years where I was going through all this stuff with him, and I said, have you ever used public housing? And he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, have you ever lived in public housing? And he says, well, my wife has public housing. I mean, basically, we live in public housing, but it's not under my name, it's under her name. It's like, guess what? Guess what, son? You're going to have to move. You need to move. Even though it's under her name, she's the US citizen, you need to find a place that's where you're not the beneficiary of government benefits. He didn't like that. He was not happy with that, but went home, talked to her, and by the next time I saw him, they had a change of address. So, SSI, that's for disabled individuals, that can count as part of a public charge issue. And of course, federal or state cash assistance. Now, I saved the good news for last. What benefits don't count? WIC, assuming the child's a US citizen. You don't get WIC unless the child's a US citizen. School lunches might depend on your county, might depend on your state. But generally speaking, school lunches are free, even if the kid is not a US citizen. Food pantries, like I mentioned before, if you're really having some kind of income issues, visit your food pantry, because that's what they're there for. They're there to help. And actually, they give you more than food. Sometimes they give you toiletries like shampoo and soap and things like that. I mean, so if you need some help, reach out for it. Don't be afraid to ask for help from the churches, from community groups. There's a lot of people there. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you have a health issue, the emergency room is always available, okay? If you need emergency health care, get it. And kind of connected to that, but it's the last one on the list, are sometimes there's immunizations, that the government puts out and offers free immunizations, like if you can recall COVID, who could forget? Anybody could get that COVID vaccine. Didn't have to pay for it, didn't have to prove that you had any legal status, you're eligible for that. It won't count towards public charge. So one of the first things that you can do to protect yourself is to make sure that you have a strong financial profile. Show that you've been making money. Bring in those tax returns, whether you need to or not. You know, like I said, better to give the person, the adjudicator, a whole bunch of stuff and say, oh, well, we don't need this. But if you have your tax transcripts for the last 5 years, oh, well, we only need the last 3. But it looks good, because believe me, they might say they don't need it, but they're going to flip through it and they're going to look and see that you have been consistently making the same amount of money. Okay? If you haven't been consistently making the same amount of money, think twice. Like, if you were making a whole bunch about 4 years ago, and now recently you've had your hours cut or whatever, and last year you didn't make as much money as you did 4 years ago, but you're still making enough. Don't bring in the 4 years ago, okay? Because now they're going to start asking questions about what happened here, right? Is this business not on good footing? You know, just sometimes you can overthink things, you know? You want to make sure that you have a clear story to tell immigration. And by story, I don't mean fiction. I mean, you want to be consistent with what you're doing. Show that you have good income coming in for the at least last 3 years, okay? You want to show that, and that goes also if you have a joint sponsor, you want to see those last 3 years too, even though they say you only need 1. Bring in 3, assuming that they're basically consistent. Again, I mentioned it above, document your skills, document the skills of the immigrant and the education of the immigrant. Bring in whatever you can. Make sure you're telling a clear story. The biggest mistake people make, they focus on what kind of public assistance they got in the past, and they don't focus on what could happen in the future, because that's what immigration is thinking about. They're trying to make a prediction as to whether or not this person's going to be a public charge. So don't worry so much about what you did in the past, although that does reflect on what might be happening in the future. So don't worry so much about that. Don't focus. So don't focus on what you used in the past. Focus on what you're going to be doing in the future, and how the future is so much better than the past. I mean, maybe you did use some. For instance, my guy with the housing, right? And he did use housing, public housing. Oops. But he wasn't aware that he wasn't supposed to. And the minute that he found out that he wasn't supposed to, they moved to their own place. And they're not going to use public housing again. They were just unaware that that was not acceptable. Don't focus on the negative, focus on the positive. Don't focus on the past, focus on the future. And that's it for right now. I hope you're having a good day, and if you want to leave a comment or two, please feel free to do that. I think I'm going to pin a question, like what's the most confusing thing about the whole process for you guys. But please hit subscribe, hit like, share this. If there's somebody that you think could use this, maybe you're in some kind of a group on Reddit or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. If you want to share it, please feel free to do so. I would love that. Always looking for new subscribers. And if there's something that you would like me to talk about in the future, let me know, because I'm always looking for topics that my viewers are interested in. I'll see you next time.